Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Shabbat. We are up to our final two Mishnayot in Masechet Shabbat, chapter Chavdalid, Mishnah Dalid. Now, in addition to the issue of how much one may exert himself in order to feed his animals on Shabbat, there is a question of whether certain foods may be fed to an animal on Shabbat if they were not designated as animal food before Shabbat. As we will see, this question involves a far-reaching machloket dispute between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda that we have encountered several times as to the extent of the muktzeh prohibition. And the commentaries explain objects that are not prepared for use on Shabbat are muktzeh. However, there is a fundamental dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about what is considered prepared for use on Shabbat. According to Rabbi Yehuda, any object that cannot be used for its normal purpose on Shabbat is muktzeh. Since the owner does not expect to use the object, it lacks preparation for Shabbat use, even though it could be used for some unusual purpose. Rabbi Shimon, on the other hand, holds that as long as the object can be used for some purpose on Shabbat, even if that purpose is not what the object is ordinarily used for, it is considered prepared for Shabbat use and is not muktzeh. And this is because Rabbi Shimon holds that an owner does intend to use an object even for secondary purposes if the need should arise. Now, specifically, the Mishnah will discuss the muktzeh status of food items that are normally intended for human use, but which were not actually ready for such use when Shabbat began. Now, if the foods were ready to be used by people when Shabbat began, they are surely not muktzeh. And the Mishnah begins, Mechatechin et dilu'in lifnei behema. We may cut up raw gourds on Shabbat for an animal to eat because they are not muktzeh. And the commentators explain gourds are too hard for animals to eat unless they are cut up into small pieces, and the exertion involved in cutting them up is therefore permitted since it makes the food edible to the animals, like we learned in Mishnah 2. Now, gourds are normally eaten by people rather than by animals, and since they must be cooked in order to be eaten, raw gourds are not prepared for their normal use on Shabbat. Nevertheless, the raw gourds are not muktzeh because they can be eaten by animals. They are therefore considered prepared for this use on Shabbat, even though this is not their normal use. Now, this Tana follows the view of Rabbi Shimon, like we explained in the Machloket, who says that an item is intended to be used even for uncommon purposes. Therefore, as long as the item is able to be used for some purpose when Shabbat begins, it is prepared for use and is not muktzeh. And the Mishnah continues, Veta nivela lefnei klavim, and we may also cut up an animal that died on Shabbat for dogs to eat because it is not muktzeh. Now, the carcass is too tough to be eaten by dogs unless it's cut up, and the exertion involved in this action is therefore permitted. Now, the commentaries explain the normal use for live animals to be slaughtered and eaten by people. And since slaughtering is prohibited on Shabbat, the animal was not prepared for its ordinary use when Shabbat began. Now, in spite of this, the carcass is not muktzeh because the animal could die on Shabbat and thereby become usable as dog food and is therefore considered prepared for this use even when it was alive at the beginning of Shabbat. And this as well follows the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda Amar, but Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and he says, Im lo hayta nevela me'erev Shabbat asura. If it was not already dead before Shabbat began, meaning if the animal died on Shabbat, we may not cut it up on Shabbat because it is not something that was prepared for the dog's use and it is therefore muktzeh. According to Rabbi Yehuda, an object is considered prepared only if it was fit to be used for its ordinary purpose when Shabbat began. The normal use of a living animal is to be slaughtered and eaten by people, not dogs. Now, since this animal was alive when Shabbat began and it could not be slaughtered on Shabbat, it was not considered prepared. And therefore, even when it dies on Shabbat and is now fit only for animals, it is not considered prepared and is muktzeh according to Rabbi Yehuda. Now, however, if the animal did die before Shabbat began, then even Rabbi Yehuda would agree that the carcass is not muktzeh because it was designated for the dog's use when Shabbat began. Now, Rabbi Yehuda disputes the first ruling of our Mishnah as well. He holds that one may not feed raw gourds to an animal on Shabbat because raw gourds are muktzeh. Since gourds are normally used for human and not animal consumption, and since they cannot be eaten raw by humans on Shabbat, it comes out that they were not designated for the usual purpose when Shabbat began, and they are therefore muktzeh according to Rabbi Yehuda and may not be fed to animals. And this is how the article elucidated note explains it. And the Rav does say, Ve'en halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. And that is in Rabotai of Mishnah Daled. We continue now with the final Mishnah in chapter 24 and the final Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat. Mifirin nedarim b'Shabbat, we may annul vows, meaning a husband may annul his wife's vows and a father may annul his daughter's vows on Shabbat. And the commentaries explain, a man may annul his wife's or daughter's vow only on the day he hears of it. And the commentators continue to explain, if a person makes a vow known as a neder, he is legally obligated to keep it. However, a husband may annul the vows of his wife in certain situations. Similarly, a father may annul the vows of his daughter who has not yet reached puberty. They may do so, however, only on the day they first learn of the vow. And the Torah speaks about this in Sefer Bamidbar, chapter 30, psukim 1 through 16. Therefore, if he hears of the vow on Shabbat, he can annul it only on Shabbat itself until sunset. Therefore, the sages permitted annulling vows on Shabbat, even if the vows do not prohibit anything necessary for Shabbat. Since after Shabbat they can no longer annul the vow, annulling it on Shabbat is not considered an unnecessary exertion. And we may ask an expert or a court of 3 laymen to release us from vows made to abstain from things that are necessary for Shabbat. And the commentaries explain, for example, a vow not to eat on Shabbat. And we know a person who makes a neder may seek release from his vow by appealing to a single expert or to a court of 3 ordinary people. The expert or court searches for a circumstance which, had the vower taken into consideration at the time of his neder, would have stopped him from taking the vow in the first place. If they find such a circumstance, they may release him. The Gemara speaks about this in Masechet Nedarim, page 22a through page 23a. 22a through 23a. Now, unlike annulling a vow, which must be performed on the day the vow was first heard, asking for release from a vow is no time limit. So one may therefore seek release from a vow on Shabbat only if it is necessary for the sake of Shabbat. Otherwise, it is prohibited because it's an unnecessary exertion on Shabbat. The Mishnah continues, Pokekin et ha'ma'or, we may temporarily shutter a window on Shabbat with the board that is not attached to it. Since the board is being added only temporarily to the structure, it does not appear like the melacha of building. And the commentaries explain that earlier on in chapter 17, Mishnah 7, we brought down a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim regarding this case. Rabbi Eliezer says that inserting this shutter appears to be adding to the structure. Therefore, he rules it's rabbinically prohibited because it resembles the Melacha of Boneh, building. The sages, however, permit placing the shutter into the window since it's only a temporary addition to the structure. Its insertion does not resemble building. Now, our Mishnah rules in accordance with the sages and therefore permits one to temporarily shutter a window on Shabbat with an unattached board. And we may measure a rag to determine whether it's large enough to transmit Tumah. And the commentators explain the rule is that a cloth of wool or linen can neither become tameh nor transmit Tumah unless it measures at least 3 by 3 finger breadths, the minimum size necessary to be legally regarded as a garment, a beged. And in this case, a rag of more than 3 by 3 finger breadths became tameh. It was then reduced in size, and after becoming smaller, came into contact with Torot. Like the Mishnah says, we may measure a rag, because again, in this case, a rag of more than 3 by 3 finger breadths became tameh. It was then reduced in size. After becoming smaller, came into contact with Torot. Food that must be kept tahor. The rag must therefore be measured to determine whether it still measures 3 by 3 finger breadths, in which case it transmitted tumah to the Torot, or whether its reduction left it with less than these measurements. That's why you're allowed to measure it with a mikveh. We may also measure a mikveh to determine whether it's large enough to be a valid mikveh. And the Rav explains a mikveh must contain 40 se'ah of water to be valid. 40 se'ah requires a measure of at least 3 cubic amot, which is 1 by 1 by 3 amot. Now, although usually the act of measuring is rabbinically prohibited on Shabbat because it resembles a weekday activity, the rabbis allowed it for the purpose of a mitzvah, since the measurements in these cases are needed to determine the legal status of the rag and the mikveh. They're considered measurements for a mitzvah. And the Mishnah relates now a story to prove 2 of the above rulings. U'maaseh bimei aviv shel Rabbi Tzadok u'bimei Abba Shaul ben Botnit. There was a story in the days of Rabbi Tzadok's father and Abba Shaul ben Botnit. There were 2 houses with a narrow alleyway between them. Their 2 roofs were connected by a barrel that reached over the alley from one house to the other. In one of these houses, a man lay dying. As a result, the residents of the second house were worried that when he died, Tumah would spread through a window of his house into the alley, and from there through a window into their house. And the commentaries explain a roof that shelters both a dead body and a person or utensil spreads the dead body's tumah to the person or utensil. The tumah is not confined to the room in which the corpse is found, but can travel to adjoining rooms through openings or windows in the walls, as long as the adjoining room is also roofed. Therefore, when the man in the first house dies, his corpse will spread tumah through the window of his house into the alley, since the barrel suspended over the alley acts as the roof. And additionally, since the barrel connects the 2 roofs, the tumah will then spread from the alley through an open window into the second house and contaminate its contents. So the Mishnah says, "Shepakeku et ha'ma'or b'tafiach," to prevent tumah from entering the second house. Its residents shuttered the window in their house that faced the alley with an earthenware container, which the commentators explain only an object that is immune to tumah can block it from traveling through an opening. Therefore, they used an earthenware container and faced the bottom of the container towards the alley, and therefore the container was able to stop the tumah from spreading into the second house, since the outside of an earthenware container is unaffected by tumah. Now, an earthenware utensil becomes tameh only through its interior, and that's why they faced it. That's why they faced the bottom of the container towards the alley. Now, this might not have been necessary because the barrel that connected the 2 roofs had a gap of unknown size in it. Now, if it was larger than a tefach, then the tumah would be unable to travel past the gap, which the Rav explains. Tumah is able to travel only as far as the roof continues without gaps the size of a tefach or larger. If there is a space of at least a tefach wide separating one part of the roof from the other, then tumah can spread only until the gap. Therefore, after plugging the window, the residents attempted to check the size of the gap to see if they could safely remove the earthenware container from their window. So they measured an earthenware vessel to see that its width was exactly a tefach wide, and after doing so, they tied it to a stick with a strand of reed grass. And the commentators explained they used reed grass for the following reason: since it can be fed to animals, one who uses reed grass for tying intends for it to remain tied only briefly, and the knot is not permanent and may be tied on Shabbat. And then they thrust it upwards to see if the vessel would fit through the gap in the barrel. This would determine whether or not the gap in the barrel that was overhanging the alley was a tefach wide. From this story, we learned that one may do the following 3 things on Shabbat. Number 1, one may temporarily shutter a window, as they did with the earthenware container in the window of the second house. Now, the earthenware container was used to shutter the window only as long as it was needed to block the tumah. Since it was only temporarily added to the house, it was permitted. Number 2, one may measure to determine legal status or to perform some other mitzvah, as they did with the tefach wide vessel. And number 3, one may tie a temporary knot, as they did with the reed grass. And that is in Rabotai of chapter 24, Mishnah 5. And that is in Rabotai of Mishnah Masechet Shabbat, Sadik Masechet Shabbat, Hadrach Alan Vadran Alach Masechet Shabbat. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.